Um, I've spent most of my life writing about doers and activists. So the first thing I want to do is actually honor all of you. Thank you. It's an honor for me to be here. You are the doers and activists. I'm trying to join your ranks. The second thing I'd like to do is apologize. I'm not very accustomed to doing this, so I have some cheat cards here, which I might need to glance at from time to time. I want to tell you about an island, which is part of a stunningly beautiful chain, home to one of the best natural harbors in the world, strategically located between two vast continents, which for decades last century was the exclusive playground of the rich and famous people like Gary Cooper and Audrey Hepburn and Ava Gardner, people who described it as paradise. And then in the 1960s came the invention of the jet airliner, and change started to happen. But even before this, there was some trouble in paradise. The indigenous population weren't very happy with their local government. They weren't even allowed to teach their own language in school. And then when mass tourism came, the change came even more rapidly. Tens of thousands of people moved from the mainland, and with it came a vast construction boom that changed the landscape, not just of the local culture, but of the geography, everywhere except on a place called the North Shore. So by now, some of you might be scratching your heads and wondering why, if I'm an island boy, I have this silly British accent. And the reason, of course, is that I wasn't born here. I was born on a different island in London. And it wasn't until I was 10 years old that my mother married my stepfather and I moved to this island. I mean, not this island, not Oahu, but a place that I call the Oahu of the Mediterranean, a little island called Mallorca off the southern coast of Spain. And Mallorca is remarkably similar to Oahu. It looks the same. It's a little bit bigger geographically. The year-round population is a little bit smaller. And in the year that I moved there in 1966, Mallorca and Oahu had almost exactly the same number of tourists, a little under 1 million tourists. Mallorca is cursed as well as blessed by its geography because it's very close to all of the major population centers of Europe. It's an hour and a half to Paris, 2 hours to London, 2.5 hours to Berlin, 3.5 hours to Stockholm, 4 hours to Moscow. 350 million Europeans can think of it as a place where they could spend a long weekend, and some weekends it feels like they all have. And as a result, last year, where Oahu had about 4 million tourists, Mallorca had nearly 3 times that number. Imagine if Honolulu were 2 to 4 hours flight from Los Angeles or Vancouver or Santiago or Sydney or Tokyo. I think we'd be in the same boat today as Mallorca. But don't think that distance is going to protect us here forever. China is going through a major boom, as we all know. They have a middle class of 150 million people now. There are efforts underfoot to try and develop them into a tourist market for us. And I suspect there are tourist industry leaders on this island who salivate at that prospect. And my advice to them is, be careful what you wish for. Because where Oahu has 1 Waikiki, Mallorca has 6 today. Large tourist areas with major hinterlands of subdivisions and apartment blocks to house all of their hotel workers. My stepfather fought against all of that. He was a lucky man. He and his 8 brothers inherited a large farm. Not that they thought of themselves as being particularly lucky at the time. The farm has no water. The olive trees produce fruit that was so bitter that they all had to be cut down. It had a flock of scrawny sheep, and nobody was getting rich off it. So he moved to the mainland, to the city of Barcelona, and he set up a law practice. I'm ashamed to have to admit it standing in this building, but it wasn't very successful. But while he was there, he saw the birth of the first major tourism center in Europe, a place called Costa Brava. And so he went back to Mallorca and he persuaded his brothers to build a little hotel. And by the time he married my mother, he had saved enough money to build himself a nice little house in the hills. And my sisters and I moved there, and it was a total transformation from the heart of London to this place in the middle, in the wilds of the pine woods, the pine forests of Mallorca. It was a place with no amenities, no garbage service. We had to burn our garbage every weekend. No connection to the sewage. We had to drain the cesspool every weekend and use the grey water to water the plants. No fresh water. The water was delivered in trucks, and in the summer we had to bribe the truck drivers to deliver the water because we were so high up the hill, and water was in such demand and short supply that we had to bribe them. It had no telephone. It had no television. At night you couldn't see the light of a neighbor's house. All you could hear was the sound of the wind in the trees. Sounds like bliss, huh? We hated it. We wanted to move back to the major city. We wanted to have neighbors, but a curious thing happened as the years went by and we hiked through the hills and through the woods and swam in the crystal waters of the Mediterranean. We started to love the environment. We had what Freud would describe as an oceanic feeling, a sort of semi-spiritual connection to nature. And then to our consternation, as that love grew, what happened is that civilization started to encroach. And today there's a subdivision that touches the walls of the house. And across the bay, there's a major tourist town that sprang up which can accommodate 50,000 tourists a night. People who look like this gentleman here. My stepfather, as I say, my stepfather fought against, he had a different model in mind. He thought of boutique hotels connected by little country lanes. And so the hotel he built himself was just 3 stories high. It was hidden in the trees, as you can see there. It's invisible from the road. It's invisible, whoops, it's invisible from the sea. You can't see it behind those trees back there. He also fought against the construction of the first freeway on the island. And he was met with derision. He advocated for something called light rail. Light rail? They said, what's that? Spain was a fascist dictatorship at the time, and a freeway was a symbol of the modernity that Spaniards saw in Britain and France and Germany. It was the modernity that they craved. So he took the case all the way to the Supreme Court, and he lost. Well, he thought, well, maybe one of the ways I can put a brake on this process of development is if I make farming more profitable. So he became, he started a farmers' cooperative. And he ran in the last parliamentary elections held under the dictator, General Franco. And the fascists were so worried that he might win that they started to cheat and they stuffed the ballot boxes and the dead literally rose to vote. And so he went to the Supreme Court again and he sued the government again and he lost again. And at that point he more or less gave up. And so the beach that looked like this in the year that I was born looks like this today. As you can see, it's unrecognizable. They replenished, as they call it, the sand on the beach, made it almost 200 feet wider. That was not my last experience of island development. I went to university, and then after, well, I should say, before I close out of that, the hoteliers in Mallorca today, they dream of boutique hotels connected by little winding roads. And I suspect my role here today, if anything, is to be the ghost of the Christmas yet to come. In 1998, 30,000 people in Mallorca, more than 10% of the population of the capital, took to the streets, they marched on City Hall, and they demanded an end to construction. But by then it was too late. The water had run out. The aquifers had been depleted, seawater infiltrated. They had to start importing water in these large tankers. They had to start building desalination plants. So here I am being the ghost of Christmas yet to come. So then when I left university, I went down to London. And I stumbled on the start of a housing crisis that persists to this day. I couldn't find anywhere affordable to live. And so in the end, I became a squatter. This is a photograph I took of the building that I squatted in on the day that I squatted it, and I became an editor of the Squatters newspaper. And the reason that the buildings, we were actually a strange mixture of people there, let me tell you. We were students and workers, we were artists and prostitutes, we were drug dealers and pimps. We were, yes, punks and skinheads. And the reason the buildings were available to be squatted is because the local borough council had decided to tear them down and had decided, and they had moved about 90% of the people, the residents of these buildings out. And they were just about getting ready to tear them down when Margaret Thatcher was elected. And the very first thing she did as Prime Minister was to impose a moratorium on all public housing construction. And so that's why the apartments were available. There were about 250 of them on a 16-block estate of Victorian walk-up tenements. Where do I go next? What the council wanted to put in the place of these blocks was 24 family maisonettes, as they call them. These things. This is within a stone's throw of St. Pancras and King's Cross, 2 of the largest train stations in Europe, at the heart of the city of London. It was absolutely nuts. So we thought we could take the opportunity of Thatcher's moratorium to turn our housing into permanent housing. But we realized that the biggest obstacle we faced wasn't Thatcher, it wasn't the local council. In fact, it was our neighbors. Across the street, there was a much more modern housing project, and the people who lived there hated us. They hated the weekly street battles between the punks and the skinheads. They hated the drug dealers and the pimps and the prostitutes, and they just wanted us out of there. They wanted the buildings torn down. It didn't matter to them if they put in family maisonettes instead. So we realized we'd have to win them over. So we started to organize street festivals. We invited their kids over, and we organized parties. We organized parties for the old folks, who the 10% of the tenants who remained were largely in their 70s and 80s. They had been terrified of us, but once we started plying them with beer and hiring a honky-tonk piano player, they changed their attitude. And then we said to them, you know what, why don't we take one of these blocks and we'll turn it into a residential care facility and we'll put in a full-time caretaker. And they said, oh, that's our dream, that's what we want to do. Yes, please. And so they all came over to our side en masse. And then we went back to their neighbors and they said, you've got to clear up your mess before you can talk to us. And so we did something that was very controversial in the squatting community. We went and talked to the drug dealers and the pimps and the prostitutes, and we said, you can live in these apartments, but you can't work in them. If you want to deal drugs or turn tricks, go somewhere else and do it. And if you don't like it, we'll evict you. And they said, try it. And we did. We evicted them. And then we went back to our neighbors again, and they said, all right, now we can talk. And we said, is this really your vision for the city? Do you really believe that little family maisonettes is the right way to go? Where are your kids going to live if you replace 250 flats with just 24 houses? And they said, you know, you're right. And we were worried about this because those things, they'll rob the vitality from this neighborhood. And so they came to our side. And so then we went to a group of progressive architects. We asked them to come up with a rehabilitation plan, which they did. And then we went to the famous socialist mayor of London, Red Ken Livingstone. He said, oh, I like that idea. And he supported us. And then we thought in this idea of building alliances, we thought, well, who is the other end of the political spectrum that we could build in? So we thought, how about this guy? And he said, oh, jolly good idea. And so I'm proud to say that the buildings were rehabilitated and they stand there to this day. So, so then I became a journalist. I traveled around the world. I married my wife, who's Japanese-American. She's always wanted to live here, so we came here to live. And now I'm standing here in front of you guys. I'm not quite sure why. I think you want to hear about these island experiences and perhaps what I'm doing on the environmental front. I'm completely lost in my presentation now, I should say, by the way. All right, lesson 1. You've got to put people first. If you're an environmentalist on Oahu, you have to accept growth. We have the lowest home ownership rate in the nation. We have a vast stock of decrepit housing occupied by multi-generational families. We have, as you know, a growing crisis of homelessness. 6,000 people sleep rough every night. So we can't, as environmentalists, keep saying no. We can't be anti this and can't be anti that. We can't love view planes more than we love homes. We can't love little furry creatures more than we love jobs. Lesson 2. There are such things as false dreams, but false dreams can turn into nightmares, but false dreams can be changed. In Mallorca, the false dream was this, that you could exploit the natural beauty of the island, you could create a mass tourism industry, you could grow the economy and build freeways and urbanize the entire coastline, except of course for the North Shore, and still preserve the essence of Mallorca. And guess what? You can't. Now, I suspect there are people in this room who think that Oahu's already been spoiled. I suspect there are people who've had the same feeling as me, as seeing a farm ripped up is like having a limb cut off. It's physically painful. You may think it's too late. Let me tell you, go to Mallorca and then come back and tell me it's too late to save what we have here in Oahu. But Oahu faces the same conundrum as they did in Mallorca. Beauty defines our sense of spiritual space here. But at the same time, it's the driver of our economy. As in Mallorca, I imagine there are a lot of people who have that oceanic feeling, that spiritual connection to nature. I suspect a lot of people in this room feel that way. Being close to nature and beauty is part of the essence of what it means to live in Hawaii. And it's no surprise to me that the most popular political slogan of recent decades here has been, keep the country country. But at the same time, we want a booming tourist sector. And if it doesn't boom, we have to start cutting our government resources and spending. That's what's happening at the moment. We need the jobs. And there's another thing. You poll people here in Hawaii and ask them where they want to live, and 2/3 of them will tell you that they want to live in a single family home with a yard. So in pursuit of that false dream, we followed the suburban model, and we built tens of thousands of single-family homes in suburbs across the island, connected by freeways to jobs and schools and shops. And as a result, we now have the second most congested freeway system in the nation. We've paved over more than 50% of our farmland. 50 years ago, we used to grow about 50% of our food. Today, we grow less than 15% of our own food. And as we've turned to processed foods instead, we've created this epidemic of diet-related disease, obesity, and diabetes, which is placing enormous strains on our healthcare system. We've put enormous strains on our water system. The Board of Water Supply reckons they're not going to be able to satisfy the new demand for water. Within less than 10 years, they're already designing desalination plants. And there's one other factor. The leaders of the tourism industry, people like Ernie Nishizaki of Sheraton Hotels, will tell you that the #1 complaint of tourists now is overdevelopment and suburban sprawl. Those cards that they have to fill in on the planes when they fly in. What do you like? What do you dislike? #1 complaint, suburban sprawl. So in a sense, we're eating the seed corn. By paving over this beauty, we're eating the seed corn that feeds our tourism industry, our #1 industry. So, lesson 3. On Oahu, if you want to save the environment, the top priority has to be the city. You can worry about farmlands, you can worry about the oceans, you can worry about invasive species. We should worry about those things, but they cannot be the top priority. Because if we don't get our urban model right, there will be no country worth preserving. There will be no country worth saving. To keep the country, we have to make the city more city. And the only way to do that is to preserve farmland. And the only way to preserve farmland is to move housing into the urban core of Honolulu, into the traditional urban core. The housing has to get taller, it has to get denser. If it gets taller and denser, that means we have to put in mass transit because the streets are already congested and there is no way that people can move around. So that means that we have to support rail. I'm sorry to say it, as environmentalists, we have to support transit, we have to support rail. But there is a lesson here. And you talk to people, you say, oh, but I don't like the idea of Honolulu that's tall and dense. And I say, well, do you like the idea of suburban sprawl? No, that's not their dream. So we have to teach them to love the city. We have to teach them that the city can be exciting. Jane Jacobs taught us this 50 years ago when she wrote The Rise and Fall of the Great American City. Dense cities are more exciting. They're safer because there are more eyes on the street. There's better social connection. There are tighter communities because people are closer together. People are fitter because they walk to the stores. That may not be the vision that you grew up with of the way that Honolulu has to be, but it is the only way to go. The only alternative is Los Angeles. Los Angeles sits at the edge of a desert. It can sprawl suburbanly into the desert forever, and nobody's going to care. We don't have that option here. And I'm sorry to disagree with James. Where are you, James? You showed 2 slides of Manhattan in your presentation, said this is not the island way. On the contrary, Manhattan has the people who live in Manhattan have the lowest carbon footprint of anybody in this nation. They have the most efficient use of resources of anybody in this nation. If we want to preserve what we love about Oahu, we have to learn to love Manhattan. Thank you.